Now, we have a remarkable thing about to happen, and that is David Scott, an appropriate name for a Scotsman, is going to tell us really what it is to be British. And he might tell you about the comma.
Just before I start, I'd like to ask you all to join me in thanking Justin Walker for all of his work in putting this together today. Justin is a fine man, but he's not perfect. 4 times I told him the title of the talk was, "Who are the British?" That's not what's on your paperwork. What is on your paperwork is, who are we? The British? So the idea I'm looking to discuss with you here today is that in order to find the courage and the determination and the spirit to make the changes, we need to remember who we are, where we came from, and what it means to be British, and all the best things of that, whilst acknowledging where there are errors, and where there was backsliding, and where there was sin, and where there was cruelty, and acknowledge that and resolve not to repeat those mistakes. I'd like to start here. It's near my home. This is Scone Palace. This enormous house here, the Earls of Mansfield. And this little chapel here is on Boot Hill. And Boot Hill is where the kings of Scotland were crowned. Right, now the first king crowned there was Kenneth I, Kenneth MacAlpin. And he was the king that united Pictland and the Scots of Dalriada and created the kingdom. So we're back about 800 odd, late 800s, sorry, late 700s AD. Now, what happened there? It's called Boot Hill for a reason. Every man who went there to witness the ceremony to crown the new king brought so much earth in his boots that every man might see the king crowned, standing on his own land. So do you see the symbolism in that? You have consent, you have acclamation, you have people electing a king. You have people electing a king from the perspective of standing on their own land, from having their own property, from being independent, from not being coerced. And that is quite beautiful, I think. Now, what do you know about Scuin? You know about this, right? The Stone of Destiny, the Stane of Scuin. Now, that was brought by Kenneth MacAlpin, 843. That's the date. That one is actually a fake. There's a bit of controversy about this. We'll get to that in a moment. But what do we know about the stone? It was Jacob's pillow. It was on which he slept when he dreamt about the angels in Bethel. It was brought to Iona in the 6th century by St. Columba, so very early. He brought it from Ireland. And who took it to Ireland? Well, that was Jeremiah, who took it from the Holy Land with the king's daughters and with Baruch the scribe. And it was stolen. One of the examples that Scotland and England are not exactly identical is the press reaction to this. In England, it was one of horror. And in Scotland, it was one of ill-covered glee. And amongst the people who stole it was a man who was later to have a stellar legal career, Ian Hamilton QC. And he described it later as, "I felt like I was holding Scotland's soul." And he did this to wake the Scots up. And maybe he succeeded. We need to wake the whole of Britain up. And when the heat was on and he realized the game was up and he had to give it back, He returned it to Arbroath Abbey covered with a saltire. And there are those who claim that he returned a fake. This is not true. We know it's not true because he's quite clear on this himself. You do not mess around with your country's heritage, with its history in that way. But he returned it to Arbroath, which has got a very special place. And you do not mock your own nation, particularly when you're Ian Hamilton, QC. And why Arbroath? Well, it's Arbroath because 1320 is the declaration of Arbroath. Now, this was an appeal to the Pope, a letter to the Pope, establishing Scottish nationhood. And Ian Hamilton described it as the UN of the time. I think he was possibly more right there than he knew. Now, in the text of the Declaration of Arbroath, there's a lot of very interesting things. I'll be honest with you, some of it's not entirely complimentary about the English. The reason for this, though, is one particular psychopathic, long-legged Englishman called Edward I, who had a very bad record. But amongst other things, it goes into detail as to where we came from as a people. Right? We journeyed from Greater Scythia by way of the Tyrrhenian Sea, that's the Med. Pillars of Hercules, that's the Straits of Gibraltar. Dwelt for a long time, of course, in Spain, amongst the most savage people. Thence came 1,200 years after the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea to its home in the west, where it still lives today. And it then claims that we have had a kingdom, reigned 113 kings of our own royal stock, the line unbroken by a single foreigner. So that was at 1320. So you're going way beyond Kenneth MacAlpin, the first king of Scotland there. You're going far back into antiquity. And in 1320, they knew this. So, we come from the Scythians. Scot means wanderer, and Scythia, Greater Scythia, is the area ringed here. That was what was Greater Scythia, but they were a nomadic people, they were wanderers, so Scythia moved around a little bit. The path that the Scots took was along the Med, Spain, Ireland, and from Ireland over to Argyllshire, and which was called Dalriada. And in there you can see some very ancient burial mounds of kings, known as the Valley of the Kings locally, the Scottish version. And then from Dalriada, they eventually formed a United Kingdom with the Britons, the Angles, and the Picts. So Scotland ethnically is quite complicated. So the Scythians here, this is an extract from the Encyclopedia Britannica. The Scythians, also called the Scyth or the Saki, or Saka, nomadic people, originally of Iranian stock. That's not entirely true, we'll come to that. And they had a very substantial kingdom. And you see from the artwork here that we're talking about a very refined people with high quality gold and metal work. We're not talking about savages. So what about the Saxons? We're here in the middle of the Saxon area of England. The Saxons were a Gothic or Scythian tribe. And the various Scythian nations have been recorded. The Saki or Saki are the people from whom the descent of the Saxons may be inferred with the least violation of probability. And it also says here the Saxons were a Scythian nation who were called various things, Saki, Saxen. And it's peculiarly interesting for us to consider the immigration of the Cymry, the Goths, the Saxons, because these branches are not only immediate ancestors, but also the most celebrated nations of Europe. That's Sharon Turner, a very eminent and early English historian. The Venerable Bede talked about the Saxons and the Angles and the Jutes coming in, and it's noted here that all the invaders to Britain were closely related and spoke dialects similar to each other and to the Frisian language. So although they have different names, they are not different peoples. They are branches of the same people. Now, this was quite interesting, I thought. This is a DNA map. This was created by studying people whose grandparents had lived in the same area. So they've excluded recent 20th century moving around and are recording here maybe the way that Britain would have looked 100 years ago. And you see the red area, that's the Saxons. And you see Cornwall's clearly separate, Devon's different. North and South Wales are more different from one another than they are from the English. You might try pointing that out. Scotland's complicated, as is the north of England. But the overriding thing is all the DNA is very similar. So these are very similar people, all from the same Scythian forebears. Now, a slight jump here. There are, in the Holy Land you had originally 12 tribes. We talked about Solomon, Alex talked about Solomon. There were 12 tribes who demanded a king. They got a king that was Saul, and followed by David. And then David's kingdom was to be established in his son Solomon. Solomon liked taxation and women, and this didn't go entirely well. And when he died, his son wanted to lay on the taxes even heavier. And the northern 10 tribes decided not to submit to this, and the country split into two separate nations. The southern one was called Judah, which consisted of two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The other 10 tribes were in Israel. Judah became shortened to the word Jews. So all of the Jews are descended from this nation here. The first time the Jews are at war, the first time the Jews are mentioned in the Bible, they're at war. They're at war against a coalition of Israel and Syria. So the Jews are not Israel, despite the current name of their nation state. Now, Israel was prone to backslide and to fall into sin and to follow strange gods and to do things they shouldn't have been doing. And they were punished with being taken into captivity. Right? So this was the Assyrian captivity. And they were removed after a 3-year siege in Samaria, their capital city. They were moved up into this area, which is northern Syria, Iraq, Iran, up into parts of Turkey and Armenia. Now, an interesting thing that I came on researching this, I didn't know this until I was researching this talk, there's a part of the Apocrypha, part of what some people claim to be the Bible, but is generally regarded as not part of the inspired text. But it is very ancient. Right? And this is the second book of Esdras. And it says, those 10 tribes, which were carried away prisoners out of their own land, were led away captive. So they came to another land. But they took counsel amongst themselves that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt, that they might keep their statutes which they never kept in their own land. And if you look here, just north of where we know they were taken is Scythia. And that, I suggest, is exactly where they went. Which gives rise to the view of how Israel wandered along multiple paths and all arrived in northwest Europe. So you have the coastal route by those who had ships, those who were trading nations along the coast of ancient Israel, which went up to Ireland, which was called Scotia Major early on, and Scotia Minor was Scotland. And the overland route around the Red Sea, Crimea, around the Caspian Sea, across the wilderness here, and into largely England. Now, when you look at the Bible, it's very interesting what you see. There was promises made to Abraham, and the promises were twofold. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to make you very rich. Your children will be enormously numerous and powerful. And in you, all nations will be blessed, which refers to Christ. So it's two promises, a physical one, which was subsequently called the birthright, and a spiritual one, which was referred to as the scepter. So the birthright was great national wealth. It says that you'll be a nation and a great nation and a great company of nations. And that you will rule nations greater than you. And you'll possess the gates of your enemies. All physical national promises. Those promises were given to Joseph, who Joseph's sons Ephraim and Manasseh were part of the northern tribes of Israel. So those promises were given to Israel. These promises, a kingly line culminating in Christ, and you all nations shall be blessed. Those promises were given to Judah. So the promises were split. Now, when you look at Israel in prophecy, you have to understand that you're not looking at the Jews, you're looking at the northern 10 tribes who were never called Jews, who migrated north and west and ended up here. I saw when, for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I put her away and gave her a bill of divorce, yet treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot also. So backsliding is part of our nature. Going from doing things essentially well and essentially right, and then backing off it, backing into sin, is part of our national makeup. God says, go and proclaim these words towards the north. Say, return now, backsliding Israel, says the Lord. I will not cause mine anger to fall upon you, for I am merciful, and I will not keep anger forever. So there is forgiveness nationally as well as individually. For lo, I will sift the house of Israel amongst all the nations, like corn is sifted in a sieve, yet shall not the least grain fall to earth. And listen, O isles. It's strange, don't you think, that Israel is referred to as O isles in quite a number of places in prophecy. Listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken, ye people from afar. Thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I am glorified. Now, there's enormous amounts of detail in this, and when you read it, what you get is a sense that we are a nation set aside for a particular purpose. We're a nation capable of greatness and capable of the most craven behavior. We're a nation that needs to learn to repent of wrongdoing. And we're a nation that when we do, we can find the inspiration to be great and to do great things for ourselves, but for our neighbours, for our fellow man. When you look at Saxon culture, my contention here is that the Saxons had the long route. They took the overland route. So they went into the wilderness to keep the laws that they hadn't been keeping when they were in God's land. So they went into the wilderness to keep those laws. When you start to see historians picking that up, you see Tacitus here talking about what he was telling the Germans. On affairs of smaller moment, the chiefs consult. On those of greater importance, the whole community. Yet with these circumstances, what is to be referred to the decision of the people is first maturely discussed by the chiefs, if you can imagine such a thing these days. This remarkable passage, so curious in political history, is commented upon by Montesquieu in his Spirit of Laws. Montesquieu, sorry. That celebrated author expresses his surprise at the existence of such a balance between liberty and authority in the forests of Germany, and traces the origin of the English constitution to its source. Balance between liberty and authority. So that's what you were bringing. Let me just briefly say, when we're talking about keeping the laws, going into the wilderness and keeping the laws, those laws would include thou shalt not steal. That includes by majority vote, and it includes houses. Those laws include thou shalt not bear false witness, which completely rules out fractional reserve banking, which is printing money out of thin air and telling you this has value, and you have to pay me for the privilege. And it also involves something called the Jubilee, whereby every 50 years all debts are cancelled absolutely and completely. That would transform the banking industry. There's a lot of parallels that you see, and heraldry tends to last a long time. I was taking some Jewish friends around Edinburgh, the first time they'd been to Britain. They'd spent a day or two in London, they came up to Edinburgh to see me, and I was taking them around Edinburgh Castle. And as I walked through an archway, I pointed up at the symbol and said, "What's that?" And they said, "That's the Lion of Judah." I said, "Correct. Can you tell me why it's on a Scottish castle?" Their faces were quite a picture. They had no idea why it was on a Scottish castle. The one on the left is the flag of Jerusalem, which they knew well because that was their hometown. That is the standard of the Scottish king, not of the Scottish people, but specifically of the king, because that's where the king came from. Now, I was looking for an example to illustrate that none of this should give rise to any false pride, any idea of chosenness, or looking down on other nations, because that's not what it should generate. And I thought a good example was this man. Now, this is the first Earl of Mansfield. He was born in the palace that we started at, in Scone Palace. 1705, and he was born to a Jacobite family. So the Jacobites had been out in a civil war, based largely on law because of the superior claim that James had to the throne compared to George and his line. And they felt that they were defending the rule of law. But this man was not out fighting. He decided to go to England to be a barrister. There being too many barristers in Scotland, some things don't change. Now, the dark-skinned girl was called Dido Elizabeth Bell. She was born to a British and Scottish sea captain, Sir John Lindsay, who had a fairly stellar naval career. He commanded the ship on which the ship's chronometer was being trialled that solved the longitude problem, and he was also involved in taking Manila. And he met an enslaved African woman, allegedly in one of the ships he captured. And they had this girl. Lindsay returned to the UK with his daughter, and he entrusted her to the care of William Murray, 1st Earl of Mansfield. And you might think that mid-18th century, being literally the only black girl in the country, virtually, I suspect, and given her ancestry, that she might not have been very well treated, but she was treated extremely well. The 1st Earl had another niece who he looked after, and the two became firm friends. You see them here in this portrait. The Earl also gave her a very good education, involved her in society, left her money in his will, and saw her married in London. So my point here is that the concept of being Israel, the concept of being a people of God, is not exclusive. It's inclusive. People can join. Right? The wife of Moses was Ethiopian. One of the ancestors of Christ was a Moabitess. This is not an exclusive view, but rather one which has enough strength of purpose within itself to allow us to be generous, even noble. Now, this same man then had to decide on the Somerset Case. The Somerset Case was a slave called Somerset had been purchased in Massachusetts Bay by another Scottish-British ship captain, this time called Stuart. And he brought him to England. And after a little bit, the slave ran away, not liking the whole slavery thing. And met with a considerable amount of support in England, mostly from the Christian community then in England, who befriended him, and they encouraged him to be baptized. And then he was abducted by agents of the ship's captain and held on a ship so that he could be transported back to Jamaica and sold, because cash is king. So the people who were godparents to this man petitioned the court, petition of habeas corpus, to see if the imprisonment was lawful. And it came before the first Earl of Mansfield. Now, at first he tried to persuade Stuart to, sort the thing out himself and let the man go. But he said, if I need to make a decision, I will. Let justice be done, whatever the consequence. Or let justice be done, though the heavens fall, it's also quoted. Can you imagine what would happen if that was employed in the child sexual abuse inquiry? Or regarding Melanie Shaw? We would have quickly resolved a lot of our problems. And when it did come for a decision, he essentially said that there is no history of slavery ever being mentioned in British law, in English law. So odious a thing can't be instituted by inference. It has to have a specific mention, and there is none. So the man was set free. So essentially what he was saying was, this place, this nation, is so free that you cannot be a slave and set foot here. It was the first nail in the coffin of slavery, and it was common law and justice asserting itself. So, to conclude, British means covenant man in Hebrew. I did check this with some of my Jewish friends. They said, we thought that was just a coincidence. I don't think it is. A covenant is a sacred agreement between God and a people. So we are about law. Law's in our DNA. The Saxons who migrated across the wilderness had a wonderful system of law that taught the Romans a lot. They came here, they instituted that system of law here. It's not Roman, it's not from any other source. But what we have now for law is changed. Rather than being a protection against plunder, our laws now are an instrument of plunder. There's a wonderful lecture, a wonderful essay by a Frenchman called Frédéric Bastiat called The Law. On that subject. And if you haven't heard it, please do, because it's just glorious. And instead of safeguarding our families, our law causes police to escort social workers into houses and take babes out of the arms of mothers. It's appalling. So we must fight it, and we must remember to fight it, who we are and who we serve. And only then will we find remedy. And I'd like to finish with a bit out of the Declaration of Arbroath. It is in truth not for glory nor riches nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. Thank you very much.